Hello, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you may be. This is Mike Geringer from Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership, and on behalf of OJJDP, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and their National Mentoring Resource Center project, welcome to our webinar today, where we're going to be talking about key methodological considerations for digging into and understanding mentoring relationships and outcomes. We're happy that you could be with us for the second part of our two-part series on mentoring evaluation and research strategies. If you missed the first webinar, we've got a recording of that up on the NMRC website, and we'll send around a link to that when we're done here today. I want to do a little bit of housekeeping here before we get started. As you'll notice, the phones are muted in terms of attendees so that we can get a nice clean recording of today's webinar, but you still have the opportunity to ask questions of our three presenters today, and those can be submitted via the question panel on the right-hand side of the screen. You see the little arrow there pointing to what that should look like, although I think that graphic is a few versions of GoToWebinar old, so it may look slightly different on your screen. But we're going to run till about a quarter after the top of the next hour. That'll allow a little bit more time for Q&A and to hear from our presenters. And certainly everyone always wants to know this when we do one of these webinars. We're going to make this recording and the slides from the presentation available early next week. We'll get this recording uploaded to YouTube and share any handouts and slides that our presenters have with you. So, no worries about that. You'll be able to get your hands on all this stuff from today early next week. I'd like to take a minute to introduce our awesome presenters today. We've got three folks that I've worked with quite a bit, three of my favorite people in the mentoring research world, starting with Sam McQuillan, who's an assistant professor of psychology at the University of South Carolina. And Sam also runs a really innovative and interesting program there through the school, and he'll be talking about that a little bit today in his presentation. I've got Nancy Deutsch, who is the Professor of Research, Statistics, and Evaluation and Applied Developmental Science. I hope I got that right, Nancy, at the University of Virginia, where she also serves as the director of their YouthNext Center, which focuses on promoting effective youth development. Welcome, Nancy. And for those of you that are on the first webinar, you remember Michael Karcher, Professor of Educational Psychology at University of San Antonio, and for my money, the leading expert we've got in this field on cross-age peer mentoring, and also a wealth of experience evaluating mentoring programs in schools and other settings. So thanks for joining us again, Michael. Just a quick bit of background for folks who were not on our first webinar in this series. All three of our presenters today are part of our research board on the NMRC, and in their roles on that, we do a lot of kind of reviews of the mentoring research, studies that have come out, evaluations of programs, and also a lot of research synthesis that we do to try and make sense of what is often a very diverse body of research on mentoring young people. And in the process of doing that, we've noticed some interesting trends and challenges that we see in the mentoring literature, and certainly challenges around what to measure when you're going to look at mentoring. What are the processes by which young people grow and change from a mentoring relationship? And we certainly have noted many challenges and studies around methodological things that may make it hard to detect the effects of mentoring. And we'll be talking about that a lot today, and certainly methodologies that can kind of cut through the noise of what's happening in a mentoring program and give a clearer sense of how young people are benefiting. So we're going to talk about both methodologies today, but also some real practical strategies, and give some examples from real life studies that I think illuminate some of these challenges and hopefully make anyone attending today, either a better researcher, or if you're a program person, kind of give you some key background information that can help you partner more effectively with evaluators in the future. So without further ado, I guess we have some goals and objectives. I think I kind of went through most of this just now, but we're really going to look at some program processes for really looking at practices. What are people doing in a mentoring program, and how does that relate to outcomes? And then Nancy will talk a little bit about mixed methods and some ways to kind of get at what's happening in the black box of the mentoring relationship. And then Michael will wrap us up with some real world examples from his work. So I'm going to turn things over here to Sam McQuillan, who's going to talk a little bit about the importance of measuring program practices. So take it away, Sam.
Thank you, Mike. And also thank you for having me. My presentation really focuses on measuring mentor behaviors, or I sometimes refer to these as mentoring contact events, what occurs when mentors and mentees meet. And my kind of pitch for this presentation was really, I thought about this through some of my own failures as an evaluator and a researcher, and also some of the frustrations and challenges that I've had trying to consume and make sense of the mentoring research, and then also making sense of the evaluations that I've conducted before. So I'm going to start with 3 assumptions that kind of guide the logic behind this presentation. And I think that most people that are operating mentoring programs would agree with these assumptions. And the first assumption is that we have some expectation for what mentors do and don't do when they're with mentees. So I've referred to this as the behavioral domain. You could think of this as like, what are the behaviors that we could observe if we sat in and watched a mentor meet with a mentee? What actually occurs in those meetings? You might also think of these as practices or competencies. What do we expect them to do? How do we expect them to do it? And the second assumption kind of gets at this last piece down there, that we have some expectations beyond what they do. We actually expect what they do to influence what happens to the mentee. The idea that these assumptions about what we think mentors are doing with mentees are also connected to the outcomes that we expect. So if mentors do something, then mentees are more likely to benefit from higher grades or have a stronger relationship with their mentor or feel more connected to society. And if you've participated in some of the other webinars we've done about logic models, you might start thinking, yeah, these are a lot like our activities that are connected to our outcomes. And we're going to specifically focus on how we take a look at some of these activities today. And then the third assumption that we have is unless we measure these program practices, it's really, really hard to connect these practices to the outcomes that we're investigating. And my proposal for this is I think we need to spend a lot more time in the field of evaluation, and particularly in mentoring, on testing why we think mentoring should work before we test if mentoring works. And I think that a lot of the confusion that I've found in my own evaluations and my own studies of clarifying this behavioral domain or the contact events of what's happening between mentors and mentees could lead us to a lot better understanding of why mentoring works, when it works, and who it works for. So Mike, you can go to the next slide if you want to. So I think that I think that there's 2 possible things that can happen if we don't fulfill that third assumption. And I broke this down into 2 errors in decision making and how we understand this stuff. One, you can imagine if we evaluate a program, maybe think about like an outcome evaluation or a randomized controlled trial. Let's say we find that it works, but we don't know really what mentors did with mentees. This is problematic for a number of reasons. And one, because we can't really communicate to others why it worked. We can't really communicate reproducible practices that another program could adopt and then encourage others to use. You can also think about another error where you evaluate a program and it doesn't work, or it doesn't work as well as we thought it did. And we really don't know why. So we can't do a critical incidence report or come up with a idea for how to improve the program the next time we try it or in a different iteration. So in response to these, I've come up with kind of 3 broad-based suggestions. I'm going to go through these relatively briefly and spend a little bit more time on an example using the program that I operate and evaluate. And then I also want to give you some pragmatic suggestions that I'll try and reserve most of the time for. Is just how do you get to actually doing these things in your own program. All right, we can start with the first one, which is that we should evaluate program practices before we evaluate programs. And the basic thesis here is that we shouldn't be evaluating programs before we understand what is happening within the program. And I think this has contributed to a lot of confusion in the mentoring literature, is that we often conduct mentoring program evaluations with very little understanding of the practices that are happening within the mentoring programs. And this is problematic because we don't have very useful research to transfer to other practitioners or to other researchers. And then it's also theoretically hard to understand why or why not a program worked. And we might also find that when we evaluate the practices, when we kind of, look under the table to see what's going on or open up the black box, that we have a lot less faith that the program is actually capable of producing the effects that we thought that it might be. And maybe we should refocus our efforts on improving the practices before we evaluate the program. And I think this would save a lot of time, money, grief, and confusion in program evaluation. And related to that is, how do we measure practices? I think that a good place to start, and Dr. Deutsch and Karcher are going to expand on this to get a bigger picture of what we might measure. But I think a good place to start is measuring actual behaviors, so discrete behaviors, rather than things like emotions or relationships and things like that. The idea that I'm proposing is maybe we should start measuring mentoring practice behavior. So why do we think that mentors move the needle on mentee outcomes? For example, a leading theory of mentoring is that the relationship quality drives a lot of the effects of the program. Well, what do we suspect contributes to relationship quality? Is that because mentors, make affirmations to their mentee, that they don't argue with them, they encourage them or use kind words, those type of things? After we have some idea of what behaviors we're interested in, then we can have some type of expected metrics for how we might measure these things. And then once we have expected metrics, we can actually evaluate the practice, so to compare our expectation versus the implementation. And in this way, you can attempt to falsify your suspicions of why your program should work before you go about evaluating the program. This leads into the third suggestion, which is to set performance metrics. And I believe that we should probably set these performance metrics beforehand, either getting some idea of what these behavioral expectations are from the scientific literature, the existing mentoring research literature, or literature from counseling or psychotherapy, or we should develop some type of democratically reasoned consensus with our program providers. If we're providing a novel program, what specifically do we think we need to do to move the needle on the outcomes that we're interested in? And a term that I use for clarifying this is the minimally sufficient criteria. What's the least that we think we need to do in order to move the needle on the practices that we're interested in? So you could ask the question, for this specific practice, what's the bare minimum that we suspect mentors could do and still help mentees in the magnitude and the direction that we want to help them? In a previous webinar that Dr. Deutsch and I did, we talked about how to measure these things in the context of logic models, which I believe is on the NMRC YouTube right now. And we talk about 3 domains of measuring these performance metrics, which is presence, that's, hey, is it happening or not? Do we even actually do this? Consistency, do we do it at the frequency or rate that we expect to be doing these practices? And then quality could get more into the idea that it's not just if you do it and how often you do it, but the quality matters. And we're going to take a look at how we could measure the quality in conversation types a little bit later. Which actually, I think, brings us to my program. Okay, so I operate a program that's called the University of South Carolina AMPed program, and AMPed stands for the Academic Mentoring Program for Education and Development. If you want a brief overview of it, you can visit uscamped.com. That gives you kind of the talking points for what the program's about. Mike, you can go. Yeah, all right. So the program is a brief instrumental mentoring program, meaning that it's a mentoring program that helps foster a relationship between a volunteer mentor and a young person. And this relationship is the context for which mentors guide their mentee through some instrumental activities that include things like agenda keeping, planning for the future, organizing their, academic life, monitoring their mood, those type of things. And all of these instrumental activities are facilitated through an approach to counseling or having conversations about behavior change that's called motivational interviewing. So we encourage the mentors to use a specific approach to having conversations. It's what they say and how they say it with their mentees when they're helping guide them through these instrumental activities. And our practices, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about when we look at practices, we have a number of practices. We're going to focus on one in particular in this webinar, but we have the fidelity measures of if they actually go through our curriculum. So we have curriculum modules that mentors may select a curriculum. For example, one is navigating conflict at school. Another curriculum might be organizing my agenda to prepare for tests, or another curriculum might be, asking teachers for feedback on my test. That's one example of practice we have. We also have this idea of like procedural integrity, that we typically like to see mentors focus the first several sessions just building a connection or relationship, identifying the values of the mentee. And then after they feel like they understand the mentee and they have a good idea of their values, they connect those values to mentee selected goals. And then they go on to identify the supports and move through the curriculum and things like that. In addition to those practices, we also have just standard soft practices, like how they greet the mentee at the beginning of the meeting. What does that greeting look like? What does it sound like? When they send notes or communication to the mentees when they're not meeting with them, how they get those notes to them, what the notes say, the content of those things. And then also another example is we encourage our mentees to actually meet with our mentors to meet with a teacher of the mentee at the school. And how do those meetings look? What's the structure of them and so on? So one of the big reasons that we think our AMPed practices should work is because mentors approach encouraging behavior change in their mentee using motivational interviewing, which I've got abbreviated MI in this slide. So we believe that our practice should work if mentors use verbal behavior that's consistent with motivational interviewing. So to measure this practice behavior, we actually audio record training and live mentoring conversations between mentees. And sometimes we'll do this in simulated conversations. So we'll have somebody role play as a mentee and see how the mentor would conduct their verbal behavior if they're talking to an actual mentee. And other times we'll actually do a live monitoring. When the first couple sessions, we'll measure the session to see how well they're using the conversational strategy of motivational interviewing. So just to give you an example of like nitty gritty, what does this look like? So a couple of our practice assumptions are that empathic reflections help mentees feel understood and validate their feelings. And empathic reflection is the use of a statement that communicates to the mentee, I heard what you said and I have a good idea of what you're meaning. And then also when mentors use change-oriented open-ended questions, it encourages mentee to explore their thoughts on how they might change and also engage in change talk. And if this sounds a little bit jargony, we're going to get some clear examples here in just a minute. So let's take a look at this example. We're going to use this example for each of our conversations. This is an example of what we would not want to see in our program. So we have some expectations for what mentors should do, but we also have some expectations for what mentors shouldn't do. So let's imagine that a mentee is making some negative self-appraisal on their current state in their math class. They may say something like this with their mentor. Well, I'm doing okay right now, but maybe I could do a little bit better in math. And you can imagine if a mentor were to respond, have you thought about using more note cards? We would consider this if we were to transcribe the audio and be going through our practices, this would be a practice that's inconsistent with our program model. And we find this inconsistent with motivational interviewing because the mentor is responding with a closed-ended question, which are discouraged. The mentor doesn't express any understanding about the mentee's kind of frustration or negative self-appraisal. The mentor jumps to solutions, trying to fill the gap without encouraging the mentee to come up with their own solutions, and really doesn't even solicit the mentee's ideas for how they might succeed on their own. Let's look at another example of something we shouldn't see in kind of our mentoring practice of how we motivate change behavior. Imagine the mentee says the same thing. I'm okay right now, but maybe I could do a little bit better in math. Imagine a kind of grumpy curmudgeon mentor saying something like, you've really got to get it together. So in motivational interviewing, we would label this as a confrontation. So that's inconsistent with what we'd like to see in our mentoring practices. So let's take a look at kind of how we would code if we actually had a practice that we were interested in. So same thing, mentee says, I'm doing okay right now, but maybe I could do a little bit better at math. So we can imagine a mentor consistent with motivational interviewing might say something like, you're not quite satisfied with your grade, and you might want to try something new. I wonder, what will you do? In this way, this is consistent with motivational interviewing because the mentor expresses empathy, emphasizes change talk, and then asks for the mentee's perspective on the solution using an open-ended question. So this is kind of an example of if we had a transcript of this type of stuff, how we'd go through. So how do we actually set performance metrics for this stuff? Well, fortunately, a lot of really smart researchers have done a lot of really great work that we don't have to do. And there's something called the Motivational Interviewing Treatment Integrity Code, which is an objective measure where you take a transcript of a conversation and there's some metrics for how you code the conversation to get a sense of how consistent is the conversation with motivational interviewing. A couple example metrics is the minimum of questions to reflections. You typically like to have as many reflections, if not more reflections, than there are questions. The reason we do this is if mentors get in the trap of just repeatedly asking questions, especially closed-ended questions, it doesn't feel like an interview. It can feel like an interrogation. So we like to see about at least 1-to-1, if not 2-to-1 reflections for questions. And then also, we don't like to see any type of confrontations or attempts at persuading the mentee according to the mentor's perspective. Those simply are not consistent with our program model. Mike, you can go to the next one. I wanted to also give some examples of programs that aren't necessarily prescriptive or don't have a formulaic approach to kind of how mentors should interact with mentees. Some of these might be identifying key experiences, practices, or behaviors that mentor do, and then getting a sense of how those look. Drs. Deutsch and Karcher will talk a little bit more about how to get into some of the qualitative or mixed methods approach of understanding these practices in a little bit. But these might be things like, memorable experiences. You could use an interview to ask students kind of what their most memorable experience for the last semester was, or if they had a memorable experience in the program. Could be, having fun or mentee selected entertainment activities like going to the movies, things like that. But the idea of categorizing, what do we think mentors do with mentees and why do we think that helps them and moves the needle on our outcomes? Mike, you can go to the next one so we have time to get through the practice. So how do you actually do this in your program? Here's a suggestion that I have, and this is kind of what we've done in our program, is form a committee of stakeholders. This might involve mentors or coordinators, directors, and so on. Use a planning meeting to create an exhaustive list of the practices that everyone democratically thinks contribute to the outcomes that we hope to achieve through our program. And then second, prioritize these activities democratically. How we do this is we divvy up tokens between each of the people that are at this meeting, and we let them privately vote on the practices that they think are priorities in the program. What do we think is most important? And then we go around and we share, like, what research evidence or scientific evidence do we have to think this? Or what's our consensus on why we think this is important? Why do we value this activity over another activity? Then third is to, discuss the priority practices. If this practice implements, what are kind of the ranges on what we'd see? Do we expect it to be 100%, or is it reasonable to expect this at about half our meetings, or at least once a year, or so on? Mike, you can go to the next slide. And then 4 is to identify methods to measure these practices. And you could measure these a number of ways using, mixed methods research, like we're going to talk about next, or method that we're starting to use right now are experience sampling methods, where you can ping mentors on their phone to complete some thoughts on their experience during the mentoring meeting. You can use audio records like we do. You could use live supervision, where you're actually there with the mentor-mentee, structured interviews, self-reports, and so on. 5 is to set some idea for what are the standards for a minimally sufficient performance metric for these practices that we have. What do we expect to see as the bare minimum for kind of how we're meeting this. And then my suggestion is to start really small and then expand gradually. Start with a mentor or a mentee. Get a sense of what's happening locally, and then try and expand and scale it so that you can get a good sense of, how your program's doing on average. But my sense is oftentimes you learn a lot from just trying to measure these practices at a very granular level. And I think that that's the end of my slides, Mike.
Great, thanks, Sam. And I'll just remind the audience, use that question panel if you have questions for Sam about any of the suggestions he has here. And Sam, while we're waiting for those questions to come in, I think I'm just often struck by how often I see in program evaluations a lack of description about what the practices of a program are, right? It's like, well, here's this program and we serve these kids, and we tested whether the program, had an impact on outcomes X, Y, and Z, but there's almost never a description of at a deep level of what mentors actually do when they're with the young people and why that would result in the changes that they were hoping for. So I hope that this is an area that, folks can put a little bit more thought into when they work with programs, and then when you write it up for a journal article or an evaluation report, describe what's happening there. I think it's just shocking to me sometimes how little that is the case. So we do have one question about AMPT, Sam. How long? You mentioned it's a brief program intentionally. How long are mentors with a student?
That's a great question. So the program is designed, we use the analogy that it's kind of like a launch pad safety net for mentoring relationships. So programs can be as short as one full school semester. And we typically design that because we noticed in a lot of school-based mentoring programs, that is about what you get for many relationships is one semester. So we designed the program to accommodate even the briefest of those relationships. But we also use it as a launch pad for if the relationships want to continue past that semester. And we have multi-year relationships and so on. But the full curriculum is contained so that you can complete what we call full cycle in one full school semester. So that could be from August to December or from January to about June.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, and I think, you've really done some great work kind of showing that mentoring can be, we always think of it as longer equals stronger. And I appreciate that you've kind of tested, well, look, if we're intentional about what we're doing, can shorter relationships be impactful for young people? We do have another question around your program, once again, around, is there a list of recommended resources around motivational interviewing for folks who run mentoring programs?
There are some, and I'd be happy to field some of these questions afterwards that we have, but hopefully we're going to have a suite of available training material for motivational interviewing mentoring programs sometime in the near-ish future that should be available. But I'm sure that once those are available, we'll try and widely disseminate those.
Yeah, and Sam, I think if you've got a list of a few go-to things that you'd recommend, we can send that out in the email that we share next week. One last question, and once again, this one's also about use of motivational interviewing, and just your take, Sam, on how well that technique takes into account race, class, other contextual factors that influence youth's experiences and perspectives.
That's a really great question. And honestly, that's one of the reasons that we chose motivational interviewing, in part because it's based on being mentee or client-centered. And the point of this is that there's no coercion and change. So for example, in our program is that mentees set goals for what they would like to set their goals around. So we don't force them to set goals for academics or behavior or things like that. And these goals are based on things that are valuable to them, not valuable to the mentor. So one of the first things we do in the program is something called a value card sort, where mentors encourage mentees to rate different values. And we've done some qualitative research to understand kind of what are common values. And the students will sort about 60 cards to identify 5 top values they have. So some of these might be like making my parents proud, or being successful one day, those type of things. And we use those values to help the mentees come up with their own goals. So I think it's sensitive in the sense that a lot of the conversation is tailored to the characteristic of the mentee, not the mentor, which I think is can be quite different than some models of mentoring that assumes that the mentor has the expertise and is coming in to offer their solutions for some perceived problem that they have in the child.
Great. Thanks, Sam. And one quick one. I'm hoping you can do like a 30-second answer to this one, but Rebecca asked if you've linked these practices with mentee outcomes.
So that's, I'll do a brief 30-second question, is that there's a very rich literature in motivational interviewing of linking the specific verbal behavior in those conversations to outcomes, and that's pretty well established. We have not done that at a granular level in our program, but we have evaluated our program and documented that our practices are consistent with motivational interviewing.
Yep. Yeah, and if folks want to learn more about that, you can actually read that program review on the National Mentoring Resource Center site. If you go to the What Works section, there's a listing of program reviews, and Sam was brave enough to put his program through the ringer. So thank you for your questions, everyone. If there's others for Sam, we can maybe address those via email, but I'd like to move on here to our next presenter. Nancy's going to talk a little bit about kind of mixed methods and the way that they can help unlock what's happening in youth mentoring programs. So take it away, Nancy.
Great, thanks, Mike. This is actually a really nice follow-on to what Dr. McQuillan was talking about. He referenced a few actually mixed methods ways in which they've looked at program practices. And so I'm going to build on that to talk about mixed methods more generally. So what is mixed methods? Is sort of, I want to start with giving you the definition of the way in which I think about it. So at its base, it commonly refers to sort of the combining of qualitative and quantitative methods. It can also be thought about as using multiple qualitative or multiple quantitative methods. But the way I'm going to be using it here, and the way it's frequently talked about, is as combining qualitative and quantitative. Now, at base, that's really about just combining numeric and non-numeric ways of representing the world, right? So if you go to the doctor and you complain of having some pain, the doctor might ask you to describe that pain. So is it throbbing? Is it stabbing? Is it sharp or dull? The doctor might also ask you to rate that pain on a numeric scale from 1 to 10 to describe how severe it is. So that is mixed methods, right? The doctor has just combined non-numeric and numeric ways of representing your pain to help them get a fuller or better understanding of that pain. And this sort of systematic combination of qualitative and quantitative methods to understand mentoring is what we are talking about when we are talking about mixed methods. Mixed methods can be applied within a single study, or they can be applied across a set of studies of a particular program or practices. When I think about mixed methods in mentoring research, I think about it as a way of seeking to understand both processes and outcomes. So it can provide deeply contextual information that increases the transferability of our knowledge across studies, but also providing the potential for real nuanced causal explanation to more deeply understand what factors might influence the potential replicability of findings within and across programs. So it really is about getting it inside the black box of mentoring. And that is essentially what Dr. McQuillan was talking about as well. And Mike, you can go to the next slide. So if we think about mentoring, right, you have youth who come into this program and they bring with them certain backgrounds and characteristics and lives outside the program. And then something happens, the practices that Dr. McQuillan was talking about. But there is both a program and a relationship involved, right? And then that leads to youth outcomes. So combining quantitative and qualitative methods can allow us to look at both what is happening inside that box, as well as sort of the outcomes from it, okay? And I'm going to talk a little bit about some methods of data collection that have been used in studies of mentoring later. So one of the reasons to use qualitative and quantitative methods is that they really combine strengths and analytic techniques. So qualitative and quantitative approaches to research have different strengths, and increasingly researchers are highlighting sort of the complexities of youth development within context and culture, including in mentoring programs. And this is particularly relevant for the study of youth mentoring, because mentoring itself is a context of development, right? That exists in wider ecosystems, right? Kids exist in more than just the program. So combining methods can let you understand the context of the programs in much more depth. So research designs that focus on quantitative methods alone are limited in what they can tell us about the interplay of individuals, processes, and context in development and in outcomes. Qualitative methods do allow for greater focus on and understanding of context, something that I think is really crucial for mentoring programs. But qualitative methods don't aspire to the same kinds of generalizability as quantitative work, which can be very frustrating for policymakers or programmers who really want to think about the implementation and scale up of programs. So mixed methods is encouraged as a way of drawing on the strengths of both of these different kinds of designs. You'll see I note paradigms here. I'm not going to talk about that, but it is essentially just acknowledging that oftentimes people who tend to do qualitative or qualitative research may come from slightly different beliefs about the world and about knowledge. I think that mixed methods projects, though, sort of try to get beyond that and move to really the kind of pragmatic questions that we have in the field of mentoring. So design considerations. So there are a number of different typologies of mixed methods designs that have been proposed. And there's different sort of nomenclature around this, or ways of naming this across different typologies. But they essentially deal with these four major areas. So there are differences in the level of integration or mixing of methods. So a study can be either fully integrated or partially integrated, right? So studies that use both qualitative and quantitative research within one or more or across components of the study, right? So it could be the research objective, the research questions, the type of data, the type of analysis, or the type of inference. And you could be partially or fully integrated across those. There's also the order of methods. So methods can be applied concurrently, meaning that you are engaged in qualitative and quantitative methods at the same time, or they can be engaged sequentially, where one method occurs before the other. So for example, you may conduct qualitative focus groups, which you then use to develop a quantitative survey and then do the quantitative survey, right, where one method precedes the other. There are also differences in the priority given. So it might be that you give equal weight to both of these if the qualitative and quantitative methods are equally important in your study. Or in some cases, one method might be dominant, that you're really concerned about, for example, measuring the outcomes, and you're doing some qualitative work just to try to understand a little bit more about process, but that's not your focus. Or it could be the reverse. You're really interested in the focus, and you're also collecting some on the process, and you're really also collecting some quantitative data, which you're giving less importance to, but using to complement it a little bit. And then, of course, there are the goals. So there are a variety of different goals of mixed methods research that I will talk about in a minute, and those can shift across designs. So these different purposes or goals of mixed methods research, this comes from work which was originally done in the late 1980s and has been updated since, but these 5 goals have sort of stayed the test of time as being 5 common goals of mixed methods research. And these are for triangulation, complementarity, development, initiation, or expansion. These are different reasons that people might use these methods together. In triangulation designs, which may be the most common, and is actually oftentimes where mixed methods research started. It was a way of essentially using different methods to sort of converge, to see if you got the same response. So if you interview people and survey people, they basically give the same basic answers, right? So it's a way of essentially kind of testing the validity of your response. In designs that focus more on complementarity, you're using multiple methods to sort of measure overlapping but different aspects of a program or a phenomenon. So you're sort of using the methods in conjunction to essentially complement each other and to understand slightly different but overlapping parts of a program. In development designs, you're using one method to help inform the other method. So for example, the example I gave of using focus groups to develop a survey. You could also use quantitative data to identify a subsample for qualitative data collection. In initiation designs, multiple methods are used to uncover new questions basically to uncover new questions. So the data does not always converge in the ways we expect. So you may set out to triangulate, for example, and you might find that actually people give different answers, that depending on whether you measure something qualitatively or quantitatively, you get slightly different results. And in initiation designs, new questions may emerge from one type of method that you can use another method to answer. So for example, the question that Dr. McQuillan posed at one point, if you do an evaluation, you find the program doesn't work and you don't know why, right? That might lead you to do another study with other methods to try to understand the why. And in expansion designs, you're using multiple methods to examine multiple components, right? So maybe you're using in a program of mentoring, you're using quantitative measures to understand the outcomes and qualitative measures, maybe you're observing to understand the process and see what happens. So another way of of visualizing what these designs look like, and we can move to the next slide, Mike, thank you, is to sort of, these are different kinds of designs and different ways of sort of depicting them. So on the left-hand side are visual depictions of concurrent and sequential designs with different priorities. So the capital letters indicate priority, so which method is given priority. The plus sign indicates that they're being engaged in concurrently, and the arrow means sequentially. This is useful when you're designing projects and writing grant proposals because it's sort of a way of depicting this that people understand, and that sort of gives you a way of showing people what your design looks like. There are a series of different kinds of designs that have been identified by Cresswell and colleagues that also, again, are useful when you are describing a design to somebody. I'm not going to explain them in depth here, but the idea is that they draw on these purposes of designs as well as the timing of them. So for example, a concurrent triangulation design is a design where multiple forms of data are collected at the same time and used to examine convergence around a particular construct or phenomenon. So that would be a concurrent triangulation design. A concurrent nested design is when you want to expand the reach of a study by addressing additional questions or by studying different levels of a phenomenon. So one method is given more weight with a secondary method embedded within it. So for example, that might be you're doing, again, a quantitative study of outcomes, and you do concurrently a smaller qualitative study inside that where you're looking at program processes at some selected sites. Sequential explanatory designs are those in which one set of methods, which are often qualitative but not always, are used to help interpret the results of another method. So you're focused on explaining and interpreting, right, one particular set of results by using another. In sequential exploratory designs, the focus is on understanding and exploring something, and qualitative methods are typically used first and considered dominant in those designs. And then you would gather additional data to help interpret those initial findings. So again, in those cases, both of them, you're sort of using one set of methods in relation to the other to get some greater understanding. Transformative designs are those that are really focused on advocating for change. So it's a sort of design that's really around, for example, like action research. So some examples of data collection for mentoring in mixed methods designs. So It's very common, obviously, to use surveys in studies of mentoring. Many of us use quantitative surveys in our studies of mentoring. They often focus on youth characteristics and outcomes. There are also a number of measures of relationship quality that assess numerically the mentor and mentee perceptions of their relationships. I definitely recommend, I'm going to give a shout out here to the measurement toolkit on the NMRC website. If you have not used this before, it's a great resource. It summarizes a number of different quantitative measures in the field by domain. So you can say, for example, I really want to, understand some social emotional learning outcomes for young people, and you can go look and see what SEL measures do the NMRC board recommend or have been used in mentoring, what ages are they good for, et cetera. In addition, you can put qualitative questions on surveys. So you can ask brief open-ended questions on surveys and gather some qualitative information that way. Semi-structured interviews are probably one of the most common tools used in mixed methods projects, or common ways of collecting qualitative data from mentoring programs as well. It is a way to get at participants' experiences, feelings, attitudes, and beliefs in a more narrative, open-ended way. You can also use focus groups for this, although I do want to note that focus groups can be misused. So sometimes people will think about focus groups as a way to basically gather interview data from a larger number of people, and that's really not the purpose of focus groups. Focus groups are really social settings, and they're best for understanding certain kinds of processes. So for example, if you run a group mentoring program and you want to understand how that group operates, a focus group might be perfectly appropriate because you're using that social setting to understand the social context of the mentoring group. But if what you really want to understand are individual level experiences, then one-on-one interviews are probably best. You can also observe mentoring. It is harder to observe one-on-one relationships, although there have been some great studies. I'm thinking, for example, Julia Price and Tom Keller have done some studies of mentoring dyads where the dyads all meet, for example, like in a school cafeteria at one time, so it's not awkward to have observers there. And then there have been a number of studies that have looked at observations of group mentoring. But so observing can be useful. And then there are techniques like diaries, right? So for example, some of the ways that Dr. McQuillan was talking about looking at practices, diaries or in the moment recordings of what's happening are one ways to get at the practices a bit. And then there are also different visual techniques that people can use, right? So up on the slides, there are two techniques that I've used in some of my research. The colorful one on the bottom is a social network map where we have kids put Post-its of different adults and peers who they interact with in different contexts of their lives. So each of those colored pie slices is another context of their life: school, after school, family, etc. And that gives us a sense of sort of all their support systems outside of the mentoring as well. And then the other is a relational graph where mentors and mentees are documenting sort of how positively and negatively they felt about the relationship over time. And in this case, I've merged a graph done by a mentor and a graph done by a mentee. They did them independently, so they did not see each other's graphs, but putting them together then lets us also see how attuned are these two to each other, right? How do their relational positive and negative feelings map onto each other? So it's just another visual way of collecting data. And for both those social network maps and relational graphs, those can actually be analyzed or considered both qualitatively and quantitatively. And you can have youth talk about them narratively, and you can also translate them into numeric data. When we think about analysis, so the decisions regarding analysis involve two major areas. So how integrated do you treat your data in a mixed methods project, and how integrated do you treat your researchers? So to start with the data question, you can quantify qualitative data and incorporate it into quantitative analysis. You can quantify qualitative data is what I was trying to say. So for example, if you have qualitative interview data, you can code that. And you can turn that into quantitative counts of codes that gets included in numeric analysis. You can also use quantitative data qualitatively to explore patterns in your qualitative or quantitative data. So just because you have numeric or non-numeric data, there are still choices to be made about how you analyze that data in either qualitative or quantitative ways. And you also have choices about whether to keep those analyses. If you have both numeric and non-numeric data, you can choose to keep that data separate during analysis or to integrate it. You can also choose how to do that with your researchers. So oftentimes researchers have more or less expertise in one method or the other, and you can decide whether you want your teams to work together or separate. I tend to integrate my teams. People might specialize, but I typically try to have everybody working across both methods. And Tedley and Tasha Corey talk about this typology of analysis techniques. I'm not going to talk in depth about these, but if you're proposing a mixed method study, I definitely suggest that you look at their work. I have a resource slide that includes their reference among others, where they talk about these different ways of treating different kinds of data together. So parallel tracks, whether you convert one kind of data into another, sequential, which maps onto the idea of a sequential design, multi-level approaches where you may have, for example, individuals within groups if you're in a mentoring program, or fully integrated. So some considerations and challenges when you're doing mixed methods research. First, there's a lot of expertise needed on your research team, so you want to think about both the breadth and depth of expertise on your team. It can be tempting to take a kitchen sink approach to methods in mixed methods studies, but these are very intense. So mixed methods studies take a lot of resources, and you really want to be purposeful in how you use multiple methods to strategically answer specific research questions. So think about what your questions are and think about what methods you need to answer them, and therefore what expertise you need on your team to enact those methods. Sample size is important. Larger sample sizes are difficult for qualitative studies, but typically are needed for quantitative studies. So you want to think about how to sample for different methods in your studies. I frequently do studies where I might have a larger quantitative sample and I have a smaller qualitative subsample, for example. And then you want to think about how to balance resources across your methods. And those are decisions you need to make in relationship to the purpose and goals of your studies. And finally, a couple of resources. So there are a number of different software programs that can assist with mixed methods research. I've been recently using Deduce because I do a lot of teamwork, and it's a cloud-based system that was specifically built for mixed methods research and allows me to easily work with people who are working on different computers and on different kinds of data. So that is one resource that's out there for you. And then on this slide, I have listed just a number of different readings that if you are proposing a mixed method study, it's very useful to look at these and utilize some of the ideas and language from these groups as you think about your study. And I am going to kick it over to Dr. Karcher, who's going to show you a couple of examples of mixed method studies of his own work in mentoring.
Thank you, Nancy. That assumes we don't want to take any questions right now. I'll guess that's correct, and maybe I can get through mine in the next 7 minutes, and then we open it up for questions.
Yep. Yeah, that's the plan, Michael. So yeah, if folks have questions for Nancy, go ahead and submit them via the question panel, and we'll get to those here when Mike's done. Okay.
Well, before we hit the next slide with the cute image, I want to say I've really been lucky to be able to work with staff in programs at communities and schools in San Antonio and Big Brother Big Sisters of South Texas. And I'm going to talk about briefly 2 studies of a mixed method approach to understanding what's happening in the matches and early outcomes. If we go to the next slide, I want to draw your attention. Back before Donald Trump, we needed to find things to get frustrated about. So after the SMILE study came out showing positive effects of school-based mentoring on a number of outcomes for most kids, this article came out that focused on the one negative outcome from the SMILE study of school-based mentoring, and that was a negative effect of participation in school-based mentoring for high school boys on their connectedness to teachers relative to kids who did not get a school-based mentor. So we observed this right off the bat. After the first year of the SMILE study, we saw, because we were tracking activities, that there was a negative association between connectedness to teachers at the end of the year and the degree of time spent in discussions with the mentor about attendance, behavior, and grades. Mike, would you hit the next slide? And then the next slide. Actually, all right, right there. So at the end of the first year, what we observed that was concerning to us was that the degree to which kids had spent time focusing with their mentors on discussions of problems in school, attendance, behavior, the lower they reported connectedness to teachers. There was a sort of a transfer effect, it seemed, where the frustration I think they felt with their mentors got taken out then on the teachers. This slide I won't go into because it's a little hard to interpret, but this is a slide showing that after controlling for where you expected the kids to be on their connectedness to teachers, time 2, which is on the left side, the vertical axis, after we control for grades and their starting level of connectedness, what we're seeing here with these red dots is the relationship between where you would expect, which is this black line, where you would expect the kids to have been in their connectedness to teachers based on everything else we knew about them and where they had started, and how much it deviated as a function of the time spent. The horizontal axis is the time spent focusing on school-based problems. So when we saw this issue of our activity logs revealing a negative association between this mentoring activity and connectedness to teachers, we went back and did an interview. Mike Knuckle taught me this method, which was to look to your outliers. If you look in the little chart here, there's 2 triangles. Those are the folks who our models don't explain well. And so we wanted to look at the ones who are low, where you see the arrow for pointing to outlier, and the ones that are high. Because in here, you see that the amount of time spent focused on problem behaviors made a unique contribution to what was happening at the end of the year. So we went to go interview these kids, and we asked them open-ended questions about the degree to which they, what were the experiences that enhanced their feeling of connectedness to their mentors. And then we were able to use their responses to these open-ended questions from the 24 kids, 12 who we were under and over predicted, to come up with a survey. If you go back one slide, Mike. Thank you. If we go down to 0.5, and this is so small, since we'll send these out, you can look at these later, but we pick up at 0.5 where it says, we created a survey of experiences from these interviews. So we took the themes that emerged from these interviews with these kids, thinking they were telling us something, and we surveyed in the following year of the study the new mentees who came in, as well as the old ones, and then we reran our regression models, and we learned some interesting things about the characteristics of matches. And this may fall into what Nancy, Dr. Deutsch, described as an initiation design, because we generated new questions to be thinking about to understand this phenomenon about the problem focused behaviors discussions and what it was leading to and why it was problematic. This, I have to say, this process of looking at activity log data and outcomes triggered for me a 15-year run of fascination with activity data and looking at these phenomena. And we just finished a follow-up study on this group 10 years later, and we still found an association between these activity logs and outcomes, benefits for the mentees. So this was instrumental, and I won't go into the ways that it was helpful, but it helped us get a sense of what mentors were doing, and the characteristics that they brought to the matches that were contributing to these outcomes for kids. This was a study that began with a quantitative discovery, right? And they first discovered this negative association, and then a qualitative exploration of what were the phenomena going on. The next example actually is from a program, if you go to the next slide, called Inspire You, which was started in San Antonio. It's a school workplace mentoring program, and it was in place after we found these negative associations for the older boys and also for older girls with this problem focus and negative outcomes. We looked to a program that was already running in Big Brother Big Sister and in communities and schools, and started to think about how we could leverage this work focus apprenticeship view so that the mentoring wasn't so stigmatizing and it wasn't so problem focused, and we would bring the kids to the workplace out of the middle school and high schools. It's a really exciting program. Everybody was really jazzed about it. The mayor was jazzed about it, and they said, now can we do an evaluation like you did on the Smile? And I said, well, no, not really, because you got this thing running in 50 businesses with kids from 30 schools. It's fantastic and people love it, but it's being done differently in all these contexts. So we've got to figure out, what is your model? And before we can evaluate it with a summative outcome evaluation, we need to know what is the model so we can be sure that it's actually being implemented consistently, because otherwise you run into the problem we discussed in the prior webinar, where programs that are evaluated before they're refined have so much variability and so much error, you'll find nothing. So if you go to the next slide, which is my last slide, this was one of my favorite projects, run on a shoestring budget because we had folks who were interested in doing this. We went in to this program that was being run differently in all these contexts. We went into 9 settings and did observations with a structured measure called the Youth Program Quality Assessment, and made observations and then used their scoring assessment to give information back to the programs about what was working. Then we met with we interviewed staff members to ask them, those of you who are running it, what do you think is essential to this program? And we got a lot of information. And then Big Brother Big Sister gave us the log data that we could use to get a sense of what the mentors were writing about doing, because we didn't really even know what they were doing or what they were talking about. And with all that information, we were able to pull together a survey, and then we were able to first have the program staff review this, and then review the survey of these practices, whittle out ones that didn't seem necessary, and then we surveyed the mentors who were in place to find out what they thought contributed to the program being so effective. And we learned some fascinating information about this through this collection of qualitative data organized to be surveyed and then linked to outcomes. The image you see there is part of a larger model that I wouldn't dare put on this slide. And off to the right, it predicts whether or not this model is used to predict whether or not the mentor planned to continue and the quality of the match they experienced. And it identified a number of the key practices that were important from the perspective of the mentors. That then allowed us to narrow the model down and then move forward to get consensus across agencies about this program, what seemed to be the core characteristics of it, and can they agree to implement that with fidelity so that the program could be evaluated. So this is one that started completely qualitative because we really didn't know what this program was. And then we only sort of affirmed it in a sense through this sort of development design through a quantitative test, so that we were able to use stakeholder input and then give one more test of the meaning of these, or the value of these specific practices being the core ones, at least from the perspective of the mentors. These are 2 examples of the sequential way in which the qualitative and quantitative methods can be so helpful in developing a program or understanding a program that's already in place as part of a larger evaluation scheme.
Great, thank you, Michael. Great examples of kind of what those mixed methods can look like in action. Just going to invite our audience today to submit any questions you have for either Nancy or Michael using the question panel. I think while we wait for those to come in, I'll just say, as somebody who spends most of their time kind of translating research into practical tools and advice for programs, I'm always a big fan of studies that combine these methodologies. Last year, we developed a series of tools designed to strengthen match support and match closure practices, and that was born out of a study led by Tom Keller and Renee Spencer, where they were looking quantitatively at how long matches were lasting in programs, and then Renee was doing some great qualitative stuff around matches that ended early and the matches that kind of fizzled out and may have left kids, kind of a little bit worse off than when they started. And as a result of her work, really identified some kind of weaknesses in staff practices, things that the staff was doing that kind of contributed, unfortunately, to matches not getting along and parents being dissatisfied and that kind of thing. So it's, Sam talked a lot about how, we can examine what mentors are doing when they're with the young person. I think it's also important to reflect back on the role of staff in that. And it sounds like, Michael, in your last example, you looked at the predictive power of some of that too. So I'm opening up for questions here. I don't see any coming in at this time. Nancy, anything else you'd like to add based on the examples that Michael gave? Or another example of your work of kind of a mixed method approach you've seen work well?
Yeah, so no, I think that was great. I really appreciated the examples that Michael gave. I think they're good examples, very aligned with the kinds of things that I do. The other thing that I've done is, which is sort of similar to the outlier approach that Michael was talking about, is using some of the typical kind of quality indicators that we use. I think in his case, he looked at outcomes. I've done this with mentoring groups where we looked at kind of the relational quality as reported by the participants in the mentoring groups, mentors and mentees, and then looked at both the sort of highest and lowest quality groups qualitatively to see what's happening in those groups. So another way of thinking, a different kind of quantitative measure rather than on youth outcomes, measure of the quality, and then trying to dig in deep to look at sort of practices that are occurring, a la what Sam was saying. So thoughts there.
So we do have a question that has come in here. I guess it's any advice for smaller mentoring programs to evaluate and understand what's working and what's not. And I appreciate that question, Rebecca, because oftentimes I get asked, oh, I want to do an outcome evaluation, and I'll ask how many young people are in your program. Well, we serve 15 mentees a year, and there's not a lot that you can do, I think, quantitatively. If there's not a lot of power stats to be done with 15 participants. But any thoughts around kind of a good approach for smaller mentoring programs, knowing that they often want to prove their value and worth?
Well, Mike,
I'll say one quick thing and then toss it over to, I couldn't tell if that was Michael or Sam, but really quickly, one thing that I often tell programs when we're thinking about designing, who are thinking about designing an evaluation, when they feel like they don't really have the resources or the numbers to do a full-on outcome evaluation, is that there is also a lot of literature, and Sam actually alluded to this when he was asked the question about the AMPed program, and he said, well, there is a good literature, there's an extensive literature on how motivational interviewing is linked to outcomes, and then what we've done is document that those practices are happening in our program, right? That's a kind of backdoor way to understand the effects of your program if you do not have the numbers to do real full-on impact studies. If you can really tightly document the practices that are occurring in your program and align those with practices that in other studies of larger programs have been shown to have outcomes, that is one way of starting to build that evidence base for your program. But also remember that 15 kids a year over 5 years, right, is what, 75 kids? Did I get that right? Right, 75 kids. So that you can also think about, if you collect data over time, does that increase your ability to document? And then I think it was Michael who maybe was going to say something.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. On the one hand, everybody thinks that they know what they're doing. I actually think most programs don't know what's actually happening on the ground consistently. So trying to get an assessment of what folks think their program does, and then really just surveying the mentors about whether or not that's happening, or they're being trained in that, or they've been prepared for that, or they're encouraged for these practices, is important. Now, Mentor has the QMS assessment, and so going through the best practices and rating process of QMS would allow folks to get that list of best practices. And then I agree completely with Nancy that one of the best ways that folks can distinguish themselves from less well-run programs in the eyes of funders and others is to get evidence of the implementation and also the perception or receipt of these practices by the mentors and the mentees. And look at Dubois' meta-analysis from 2002 in that chart that we gave out in the last webinar, showing that the magnitude of the impact of your program is directly related to the number of best practices. And so if you can't do a large-scale impact study, you can get external validation of the number of practices that are in place consistently in your program. And that should be as good evidence as really, that's very good evidence of the expected impact that you're having on kids. So I think all programs would do well to really make sure they start off with, what are we doing, and are we doing it consistently? Are mentors getting what we say we're giving? And if we were to tally that up, how many best practices are we delivering consistently to our mentors as a starting point, regardless of whatever evaluation approach you take?
Great. Thank you, Michael. And just in case folks are wondering what Mike was referencing there with QMS, that's the National Quality Mentoring System. It's a new service that Mentor is currently piloting with some of our affiliates around the country. We hope in the next few years to have that rolled out nationally at a full level. But it basically is an assessment that tells a program kind of how aligned they are with the elements of effective practice, and offers some suggestions for improving program practices. And I couldn't agree more with what you said, Michael, around monitoring implementation. Almost every research study or evaluation I see where the program didn't achieve its outcomes, you can usually find the reason behind that in their implementation data. Mentors not meeting as frequently, or in the case of a program like SAM's, not doing or saying the right things. Also a lot of lapses around staff. Oh, we didn't train all the mentors, or we didn't follow through with our monthly check-ins and didn't troubleshoot matches that were struggling a little bit. So I think focusing on the things you mentioned it's good advice for everybody. So I don't see any more questions in the queue, so I think we're going to go ahead and wrap us up today, maybe give people a minute or two back in their day. So as a reminder, look for an email early next week that would have a link to the recording of this webinar along with a copy of the slides. And Sam, Nancy, Michael, if there's any other kind of print material you'd like to share with folks, we can also include that in the email. And just as a reminder to any of you program folks that are, kind of inspired by this to maybe take another stab or a better, take on an evaluation of your program, there is free technical assistance available to any mentoring program in the country through our National Mentoring Resource Center. If you go to the website, the URL is at the bottom of the slide there. There's a big red button that says request technical assistance. It's easy to find, and we've got a cadre of folks around the country that, can help you figure some of this out, including, questions you may have around evaluation. Nancy mentioned that measurement guidance toolkit. We hope to have that launched on the site in June, at least the new additions to it. The current ones are up there now. So if you're looking for, recommended outcome measures on a whole variety, I think there's about 30, 35 different outcomes where we've recommended an easily accessible tool to measure those that we felt was a good fit for mentoring specifically. But over the summer, we'll be adding these measures of relationship quality. And frankly, you're probably not going to get those outcomes if the quality of those matches is not high. So, and then just lastly, as we close up here, there should be a little quick evaluation form that pops up in your web browser once we end the broadcast here. So please fill that out. It helps us improve these webinars in future events and gives us some good feedback to take forward on this project. So on behalf of the NMRC and the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, thank you for joining us today, and look for more good stuff coming out from the NMRC and throughout the rest of the year. So thanks to our presenters, and thank you all for joining us today. Bye.